Pessoal, é, todos me escutam? Boa tarde a todos. Prazer receber vocês aqui nessa tarde, sexta-feira. Esse é um encontro bastante particular, é um evento em conjunto do Tiaços, né? Representado por mim e pela Luciana Ximenes, Tiaços Oficina de Imaginação Compartilhada, em conjunto com o Departamento de Ecopsicologia da JB, da Associação Junguiana do Brasil, e com a editora Vozes. Estamos hoje aqui reunidos, então, para a gente prestigiar o lançamento em português da nossa convidada. Seja bem-vinda, Mary-Jayne Rust, do livro dela, Ecopsicoterapia, publicação recente, traduzida pela editora Vozes. Mais do que nunca, eu não vou me alongar muito, é apenas uma primeira fala. Mais do que nunca se faz impossível separar hoje, nas atuais condições contemporâneas do mundo, palavras como sofrimento psíquico, saúde mental, catástrofe ambiental, desastre climático. Essas quatro palavras, elas se aproximam de modo irrefutável, inequívoco, e a junção dessas palavras nos convoca a ter que pensá-las de um outro modo. Um dos nomes de se pensar essas quatro palavras juntas, essas quatro novas palavras juntas, se chama ecopsicoterapia. Por isso o livro da Mary-Jayne se faz tão necessário e urgente. Quem vai coordenar o nosso debate hoje é a nossa queridíssima amiga, especial amiga Dani, a famosa Daniela Lascani. A Dani é uma apreciadora de mundos permeáveis, ela atua como psicóloga clínica, ela é especialista em arte-terapia, em ecopsicologia, pela Pacific Graduate Institute, na Califórnia, onde a própria Mary Jayne leciona. Atualmente, a Dani ela está coordenadora do Departamento de Ecopsicologia da JB, da Associação Junguiana do Brasil, e ela também é, talvez a parte mais interessante da biografia dela, é mãe do recém-mãe do pequenino e formoso Romeu. Então, queridíssima Dani, por favor, faça as honras da casa para receber a nossa convidada. Sejam bem-vindos.
Obrigada, boa tarde a todos, todas e todes. A gente está aqui hoje para prestigiar aqui o lançamento do livro Ecopsicoterapia da Mary Jayne, que em inglês, em inglês está como, né, o título Towards an Ecopsychotherapy, né, uma visão de mundo, né, uma abordagem, uma forma de olhar e trabalhar a psicoterapia de um jeito mais orgânico, holístico, completo, né, e afetivo, né? Então, o livro da Mary Jayne me chamou a atenção, né, né, a Vozes topou aí essa empreitada de fazer a tradução e para nossa felicidade, aí como o primeiro livro, né, a ser traduzido por português nessa área, nessa abordagem da ecopsicoterapia junguiana. Então, é uma honra que a gente possa receber aí Mary Jayne para nos contar um pouquinho mais sobre como foi, né, como é a trajetória dela aí nesse livro, né? Ela, né, assim, para ela tem, né, a psicoterapia, ela está vivendo aí uma forma de desintegração, né, daquilo que é familiar para a gente, daquilo que é conhecido, da forma mais estrutural que a gente conhece a psicoterapia, né, e como ela bem fala, né, que a pele da nossa cultura está se desprendendo e nos conectando mais com o presente e com aquilo que nós somos, né? Então, é uma honra receber a Mary-Jayne Rust, que se apresenta como uma ecopsicoterapeuta com 40 anos de experiência, inspirada por formações em arte-terapias, psicoterapia feminista e análise junguiana. Nas viagens a Ladakh, acredito que seja assim que se fale, no Planalto tibetano, no início da década de 90, alertaram para a gravidade da crise ecológica e suas raízes culturais, econômicas e espirituais. Isso a levou ao campo da ecopsicologia, que tem sido seu foco de ensino e escrita desde então. Suas publicações podem ser encontradas no site dela, depois a gente pode colocar no chat, escrever o site dela para que vocês possam acessar. E nessas publicações você consegue encontrar o Towards an Ecopsychotherapy, né, no original, e também o Vital Signs, Psychological Responses to Ecological Crisis, né, traduzindo Sinais Vitais, Respostas Psicológicas à Crise Ecológica, tá? Editada pela própria Mary-Jayne e pelo Nick Totten. Ela cresceu à beira-mar e adora nadar. Atualmente vive e trabalha ao lado de uma floresta antiga no norte de Londres, onde mantém um consultório de ecopsicoterapia, tanto em ambientes internos quanto externos. Mary-Jayne, seja bem-vinda. Agora te passo a palavra para você nos contar aí o que você veio dizer.
I can hear you well, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's very exciting to be with a Brazilian group of people. I've never been to South America. I've traveled in quite a lot of different places in the world, but never South America. So it still remains a mysterious continent to me, but exciting. And I hope to learn a little bit more this evening. And just one little thing about my name, which often gets very confused in where I live. It's Mary-Jayne, and people often call me Mary, which is like nails on a blackboard for me. I really don't like being called Mary. So either Mary-Jayne or MJ is also fine. And in England, I always remind people that my name, as you would know, in Spanish is marijuana. So that's a good way of remembering it. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the field of ecotherapy, ecopsychotherapy, ecopsychology. These terms are often confusing for people, so I'm going to try and clarify a little bit, and say a little bit about, what I'm saying in my book. And I'm just going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then I hope there's going to be lots of time for questions and discussion. So it's a very big field to try and put into 10 minutes. I will do my best. So ecotherapy and ecopsychotherapy, they've grown out of the field of study called ecopsychology. And this is the study of our human relationship with the more than human world, or the rest of nature. And of course, I'm using those terms, they're a bit clunky, but instead of saying humans and nature, which just reinforces that awful dualism that humans are not part of nature. So no doubt, you're all familiar with the issue here, which is why ecopsychology has arisen within the Western mindset, which is now spread around the world through industrial growth culture. This mindset believes that humans are separate from and superior to the rest of life. And arguably, that's the cause of our current ecological crisis. Nature is just a collection of objects to be used. So in English, I don't know whether it's the same in Portuguese, but in English, we have he and she for humans, but all of the rest of nature are referred to as it. So again, emphasizing the objectification. And of course, only in our history, only humans have souls. So we have taken the soul out of nature. And not only that, all peoples who've been associated closely with nature have also suffered from being made into objects, resulting in terrible trauma. We're all familiar with this, the genocide of indigenous peoples and the eradication of their cultures, transatlantic slavery and the oppression of women. They're just a few examples. So a terrible hierarchy has been created of beings and peoples. And those of us growing up within this mindset suffer from feeling the term that is used is disconnected from the rest of nature, disconnected from source, actually disconnected from a profound sense of healing and guidance. And I talk a bit more about this in chapter 3 of my book. So the practice of ecopsychology, which began around the 1960s in the west coast of the States, was all about so-called reconnecting with nature. I don't really like this term, disconnection and reconnection, because we're all connected with the rest of nature all of the time. We can't not be connected. So what does it really mean? What has actually really happened? What is this illusion that we are separate from the more than human world? I think it's more that we have lost, we sort of gradually, when I say we in this industrial growth culture, we've gradually withdrawn from a deep, intimate relationship with the more than human world, which we can see if any of people spend time in indigenous cultures, for example, traditional cultures, where there's a very different relationship, a sense of humans feeling that they are living inside something rather than outside or on top of, when it's this terrible alienation that's happened. So ecopsychotherapy has emerged out of this, and it's a very new field. Ecotherapy has existed since the sort of 1980s. Ecopsychotherapy has really only just happened in the last decade, or it will certainly be named in the last decade or so. And it's been growing quite fast here in the UK, and it's got taking a number of different forms. One of the first books to come out was Taking Psychotherapy Outdoors by Martin Jordan. And then we've got wild therapy, which is alongside the rewilding movement, which has really taken off here. And there are many questions about how we rewild ourselves. There's Buddhist ecotherapy, there's environmental arts therapies, and all of these have over here become one-year trainings. So they're post-qualification, that people who've already trained as a therapist will go and do these one-year trainings. More recently, a woman called Beth Collier, a woman of colour, has developed a one-year training to support people of colour spending time outdoors and then training as therapists. Because a lot of people of colour only feel comfortable in the cities and don't really feel like they're welcome in the more white countryside. So ecopsychotherapy is part of a much wider field of ecotherapy. And put simply, ecotherapy is the practice of humans spending time in the more than human world for a kind of mutual or reciprocal healing. There are many diverse practices: wilderness practice, animal-assisted therapy, horticulture therapy, walk and talk therapy. I could go on. I mean, the list is endless and it's growing. So ecotherapy is really about the healing power of nature. And there's a great deal of research to show how this happens, such as people who have a green view from their hospital window will heal faster and need less medication. the greening of prisons mean less self-harm for prisoners, fewer attacks on staff, and reduces reoffending. Planting trees in cities reduces the crime rate. I could go on. And of course, it's very important to say that the ecotherapy practices stand on the shoulders of indigenous knowledge, where the healing power of nature is just a way of life and takes many forms depending where in the world you might live. And ecotherapy has grown in the UK, particularly, I mean, much more of a sort of white middle class thing to begin with, but actually in around 2008, a big report came out researching into the benefits of humans spending time in nature, and a mental health charity called Mind has created projects for people suffering from mental health issues, like working in community gardens, walking together for people with depression, and so on. And so in this way, it's expanded from being a sort of privileged practice for the people who can afford it, to now being available for working class people and people of colour. Also, we have green prescriptions where doctors might prescribe a walk in nature instead of antidepressants. Now, all of that, I think, is quite complicated, not as straightforward as it may sound, but I think it's a very interesting and good development. So what's the difference then between ecotherapy and ecopsychotherapy? So I'd say they were on a spectrum. At one end, we have ecotherapy, which is about the healing power of nature, as I've said. As it started out, it was very much to do with reciprocity. So if any of you have seen the film My Octopus Teacher, it's the story of a man who is burnt out and he goes out into the ocean of his childhood. He makes a relationship with an octopus and basically he falls in love. He falls in love with the octopus, he falls in love with the kelp forests, and after about a year, he is rejuvenated and then feels moved to set up a charity to help kelp forests which are being degraded. This is something I've seen a lot happen, that people feel so nourished by spending time in the outdoors that they feel moved to give back in some way. And of course, that may be planting trees, it might be speaking out on behalf of the more than human world. It could be 1,000 different ways in which people take action for the earth. So, and it can happen the other way around. We go out to plant trees and we feel healed by that action. At the other end of the spectrum is ecopsychotherapy, where a therapist of some description is present, facilitating the process. So you've got 3 rather than 2. And there's lots of permutations and combinations of how that threesome might happen. One at the far end is long-term ecopsychotherapy with people who come with the same kind of problems that they would bring to a psychotherapist. And you're working at a deep level, but you're using the metaphors of the world around you, or indeed creatures who come into the sessions and make interventions in a way, they add to the sessions. So I wrote some stories about what happened in chapter 1 of my book. There's lots of stories there. I don't really have time to go into those here, but you know, just to say my first experience, I remember very clearly my first experience of trying this out. And you can just see a Velux window at the back. There's a forest right behind where I live, so I'm incredibly lucky with that. And so I'd been working with someone for quite some time, a psychotherapy client, and one day she found out about the work that I was doing and she said, can we work outdoors? And I I suggested that we should talk about it for quite some time, because obviously it was a huge change in the work that we were doing together, and what would it mean for us. But anyway, eventually we took the plunge, and we went outside. And it was quite tricky for me, because at that time, this is quite a long time ago, I was worried that I might get struck off for doing such a thing, because you're sort of really changing the boundaries of psychotherapy. Anyway, we went ahead, and I remember very clearly the first thing I felt was I just felt incredibly supported and nourished by being in the woods. I didn't really know how to do it. What was the procedure? Anyway, we wandered through the woods. We found a place to sit against a tree. So then we were sitting side by side. This is very, very different to sitting in a room where I'm in my chair, she's in her chair. It's much more, there was much more of a sense of equality. And it actually, for a while, it kind of didn't seem that different. Our dialogue didn't seem that different to when we were indoors. So it took quite a while to get accustomed to how to listen to her and everything that was happening around us. But just to give you one little example, she was grieving for her mother at that time, who had died about 1 year previously. And at the beginning of the session, she just said, "There is no new life." And at that moment, an acorn dropped into her lap. So the tree was intervening in the session in a way that, I wouldn't never have said, "Of course there is new life." I wouldn't say that as a therapist, but the tree said it to her. And there's a million other ways in which things like that happen in sessions outdoors. Now, some issues with ecotherapy, which I think I should mention, tricky issues. So, as I said, ecotherapy started off by being reciprocal, a mutual healing between humans and the more than human world. Now, it's great that it's becoming a lot more mainstream in the UK, but surprise, surprise, as it's become very mainstream, the healing of nature has disappeared. If you do a search, Google search on what is ecotherapy, you will find that it's just about healing humans. It's not about healing the earth anymore. So it's kind of not surprising, because ecotherapy has just got sucked into a consumer mentality, that humans go out into nature to get healed. And a lot of the time, people don't know necessarily the land that they're working on. They might drive. I mean, this would be the worst thing, or even flying somewhere to offer an ecotherapy workshop to a place that you don't know. I mean, as I say, this is a caricature. So it's really important to me and to many of my colleagues that we bring ecotherapy back to its reciprocal roots. And as I've been doing some lectures for Pacifica recently, and I've come up with a few terms which are actually sort of around and beginning to get used, that I think are quite useful. So one is a simplistic ecotherapy, which I think is around a lot. Oh, I just go out and see the pretty bluebell woods and I'll make myself feel better. This is not, this is insulting to the complexity of nature, and it's actually insulting to the complexity of humans as well. Human-centered ecotherapy, where it's all about the healing of humans. Now, as we move more into a two-way thing, a relational ecotherapy, where actually we are in the idea is that we are in relationship with the more than human world. We are respecting that it's not just an it or an object. When one of the things I try to do with my clients, we make a threshold, before we go into the woods and start the work. And at the threshold, I invite my client, we say together to the woods, can we have your permission to come in and do our work together and see what happens? I've never had a no yet. I've never felt a no, and neither of any of my clients. We've always been really welcomed. But I do that in order to remind myself as well that when it's not just about us going in and getting something. And then there's reciprocal ecotherapy, where maybe you might offer something back. I mean, I know in various different traditions, there might be chocolate offered, or there might be herbs offered. In my tradition, we might go litter picking. I might go litter picking. I might, some people actually offer, I know in the States, ecotherapists offer a tithe to the Native American tribe whose land that they are on. So while they're practicing ecotherapy. So there's many, many different ways in which you can actually give back as well as being in relationship. Now, the other very tricky issue is cultural appropriation. Of course, this stems from white people absolutely yearning to belong. And I think it's much more common in the States than in the UK, that many white people go to native ceremonies, they take practices without permission, and at worst take the practices and make money from offering them. And I think everyone would agree this is just absolutely a no-no. This cannot go on. A woman called Peggy Ayres wrote a book called, where have I put it? I can't find it. Ancient Spirit Rising. She'd done quite a lot of research in the States. Actually, she lives in Canada, and she used to go to ceremonies, and then she started to understand that this wasn't okay. And she did some research and found out that actually Native people no longer wanted white people to come to their ceremonies. And so she started to think, well, you know, then as white settlers, we have to return to our own cultural roots. So her book is about how do we access European indigenous knowledge? What are all the different ways of doing that? One of the things she suggests is having DNA tests and knowing where you're from and going back to that. I mean, I think this is problematic. I think it's much more complicated than just having a DNA test and then going back to your ancestry. But I think there's some important things in there to consider. I think it's very interesting. We have to think carefully about cultural appropriation. But it's understandable that it's happened. So there's also, I'm well over my 10 minutes. So I will just name that there's a whole other piece about working with eco-anxiety and eco-grief. That's in chapter 4 of my book. Chapter 5 explores how anthropocentrism might come into the work of ecotherapy, or how do we begin to take back our projections onto the more than human world. I think there's a big parallel there between men taking back their projections onto women, the work of undoing sexism, and the work of racism, undoing racism and the kind of projections that white people put onto people of color. So anthropocentrism is another whole layer within that, of course, and it's intersectional. They're all related, those isms, those projections. And the last thing I want to say is that ecotherapy is not, I mean, it's become about being outdoors. And of course, it's a very big part of ecotherapy, but it's not just about that. It's about knowing being able to tell our stories in relation to the land and creatures. You know, we were not, psychotherapy is about trauma and healing in human relationships. Ecopsychotherapy is expanding that out to include our relationship with the land and everyone we've been in relationship with from the start. That's obviously a huge project. But in a way, it's not just about ecotherapy, it's about a sort of cultural change that has to happen of how we see ourselves in the world, and that we're not just humans walking around with a sort of blank screen behind us. We are all in relationship to the other than human world as well as to humans. And we have to begin to learn how to tell our stories differently. Eco-biographies, I would say. So I'm going to stop there and invite questions. I believe some questions have already come. And so I have them in front of me.
Muito obrigada, Mary-Jayne. Sim, você tinha dito que que falaria em torno de 10 minutos, mas o tema realmente é muito instigante e, né, dá para ver o quanto que você se envolve, né, com a ecoterapia e com a ecopsicoterapia, né, e com essa temática. Então, como a gente saberia que a gente tinha pouco tempo, né, preparamos aqui alguns colegas para fazer algumas perguntas, né? E, e aí eu gostaria, né, de começar, né, assim, trazendo um pouquinho, eu até falo no prefácio, né, que uma das nossas trocas, né, uma das primeiras solicitações, quando a gente começou a conversar, foi que havia um pedido, né, para que o indígena fosse colocado em letra maiúscula, né, por uma questão gramatical aí na língua inglesa, né, que eles pudessem ser considerados aí em primeira pessoa, né, e com importância, né, porque eles eram colocados como letra, né, em letra minúscula. Então eu queria saber, né, fiquei muito curiosa para saber como é que foi esses contatos, né, que mudaram aí a sua percepção, né? Queria que você contasse um pouco. E também, né, aproveitando que você traz bastante essa questão política, social da ecoterapia, né, como ela precisa se envolver, né, com o aspecto cultural aí de privilégios, principalmente da cultura ocidental, branca, né? Eu queria que você também nos trouxesse a sua visão, né, de como que o norte global tem se aberto para visões mais integradas aí com populações do sul global, né? Como que a ecopsicoterapia e a eco e a tanto a ecologia quanto a ecoterapia tem se aberto para estudar também outras visões que não sejam os estudos a partir do norte global, né? Então, queria que você comentasse um pouco e depois eu vou chamando aí alguns colegas, e se a gente tiver tempo, né, a gente vai avançando aí nas perguntas, tá bom? A gente tem que, não sei como que é para você, se a gente passar aí do horário que você tinha se proposto a ficar.
Okay, so it's a very long question. So I'll start with the first bit. How come I requested that capitalization of Indigenous? What brought me to that point? So, I mean, the short answer is that, you know, I had, just before I wrote the book, I was aware that this was a request. And I honestly, I was trying to remember in relation to your question, I was trying to remember where I heard that from, and I can't remember, but I remember doing some research at the time and finding out that it was United Nations guidance that Indigenous people should be capitalized. And so when I sent my script in, the publisher, the editor, picked it up and said, we're going to have to change all of this back to small letters. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. It's been requested by Indigenous peoples, and it's about respect. And so he agreed to the change. There's a much longer answer, which is that you said, you know, who did you have contact with, which ethnic groups, and can you tell us about them? So I would say that my first awareness of Indigenous peoples was through reading Jung. I discovered Jung when I was about 14 years old. My teacher at school recommended the class to his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I had already heard about him, and I went straight to the bookshop and bought it. And it was very helpful to me because he wrote a lot about his relationship with nature and how it sort of conflicted with his Christian upbringing. And that spoke to me. I had a Christian upbringing, and already a very strong relationship with nature from year dot. And so he helped me make sense of that. But he also talked about his trips to the States and to Pueblo peoples. And of course, you know, he's not great sometimes at talking about these things. He's quite racist. That's a long story, isn't it? Then I spent a year in Norway after I left school, and became aware of the Sami people up north. And at the end of the year, traveled with an American friend. We hitchhiked all the way up to Lapland. So that was my first experience of seeing people living in teepees and being aware that actually they were oppressed peoples, and they looked very different to the white Norwegian people. And my friend from the States educated me about the terrible treatment of Native Americans in the States. So my education was growing, and all the way through I was interested to get my hands on reading. But there was a big leap when I went to Ladakh in the early 1990s. I went twice, and it had a very big impact on me to actually spend, you know, a few weeks each summer. It wasn't very long, but within a traditional culture, and to see how different it felt, how actually a lot of the mental illnesses that we think of as sort of just being part of being human, actually that they didn't suffer from those mental illnesses. They were experiencing the first psychosis in Ladakh while I was there. And just to explain, I don't know if you know anything about Ladakh. It's on the Tibetan plateau. It's had its borders closed until the late 70s because of its proximity to China. And so Western tourists only started coming in the late 70s. And the person I went to stay with is a Swedish woman called Helena Norberg Hodge. She's done lots of work out there, setting up an NGO, making them aware of the impact of the Western values on their culture. It was a very interesting time, but it was her that really pummeled me into understanding a lot about, well, certainly about the seriousness of the ecological crisis. I really woke up to that then. But also through her, I really learnt so much about the experiences of the people there. And actually, as part of a film that she was making, I hosted some Ladakhi women over here. One of the things I learnt was when I had these two women to come and stay with me, I put them in separate rooms, and then they came to see me later in the day. They said, Mary-Jayne, Mary-Jayne, can we sleep in the same room? And I discovered that they had never slept on their own. I mean, this was such a, I mean, it's just completely, so many things challenged my worldview. So, and then since, you know, really the whole way through, I found people to, I've met people who've had a foot in both worlds. That has been incredibly helpful. I've read lots of people's experiences, who've spent time out there, and also got very interested in people here who are working to reconnect with our own ancestry. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. And I think sometimes I wonder why has it become such an important issue for me? And I think it's partly because I grew up in rural Norfolk. My father was a miller. So I grew up very much part of the farming community, and my father particularly was a great lover of nature. And he was very grounded. He wasn't in the least bit intellectual. My mother didn't have quite the same bond, but I still had a childhood which had a lot of the values that I then recognized in Ladakh, where, you know, that of course it was a mix, obviously, but I think it's very close to my heart because of my upbringing, really. So the next piece of your question, they're your questions, Daniela, are they? Yeah.
Respondeu sim, Mary-Jayne. E para a gente dar seguimento nas perguntas, eu queria chamar a Fátima também, lá do Departamento de Ecopsicologia da JB.
Olá, que alegria, Mary-Jayne, te receber. Alegria estar aqui. Seu livro mexeu muito comigo. E eu vou ser breve. Gosto muito quando você fala, você não fala assim, mas você coloca a ecopsicoterapia não é só mais uma técnica para se tratar pessoas ou para se colocar pessoas na natureza. É uma atitude, né? É uma atitude diante do sagrado da vida, diante do sagrado da psicoterapia, diante do sagrado da ecologia. Enfim, eu queria lhe ouvir um pouco mais nas primeiras experiências, porque quando você foi mudando de atitude, talvez você não esteja mudando, talvez a gente que é mais da cidade vá se mudando assim por dentro, que é sair da condição da natureza ser um recurso na psicoterapia para a natureza ser coterapeuta. Então tem uma coisa de confiar, de fiar junto. E tem uma brincadeira com seu nome, que é Rust. Trust. Bom, eu quero lhe ouvir um pouco mais sobre as primeiras experiências dessa parceria com a natureza e o caso clínico que você estava acompanhando.
It's interesting, this idea of nature as co-therapist, because I don't feel comfortable with that. Can I say, because a lot of people use that expression. I mean, how can I say that I'm co-therapist with something that's vast and unknowable? It's a bit like saying I'm co-therapist with God or something. So I'm inside this mysterious great being. That's how I suppose I think about it, that it's completely unknowable and unfathomable, and manifests itself in a sense in everything, and including ourselves. So, and of course, from a Jungian perspective, you know, we would talk about the self. Um, and it's very interesting to think about how that sits alongside the ecological self, because the term the ecological self is the part of ourselves that knows that we are part of this larger being. We're a cell within something much larger. So we are a kind of small self and we are a much larger self, which there is a parallel there with Jung's idea of the sort of small self and the self. I think there are differences as well, but anyway, I won't go into that some more. But you asked about my first sort of, can I say more about my first experiences of going out? So I've said a little bit, you know, that it felt, I mean, it felt quite extraordinarily strange because I was so used to working in a room. But I think in a way the room can, you know, it's very containing. Of course it is containing. And actually there are times where I still feel that someone, maybe for a stretch of sessions, you know, I have this sort of thing of working out and in, you know, if the person feels, if my client feels like they need to be in, then we'll be in, because there are times when we need that containment. But so going out, it felt incredibly expansive. And as I was describing, you know, the sitting with our backs against a tree, that completely changed the dynamic of how I felt in the room, where I have my chair that I sit in as a therapist. And so I felt disarmed. I sort of felt naked in a way, that I didn't have any of my normal, we might say that they're defense structures, you know, working as a therapist. I felt it was awkward for a little bit because between where we met and then where we chose to settle, what did we chat? This didn't feel comfortable at all because I'm so used to opening the door, going into the room, starting in silence. And we have that structure and that containment. It's like a ritual, isn't it, when we work in a room? So it took me a while to get that sorted out so that there weren't periods of chat, which didn't feel helpful. But nevertheless, it still felt, can I say, I just felt that I was more myself. I feel like that's been happening the whole way through. I mean, I've been working as a therapist for 45 years. And I think in the early stages, I was too caught up with how I was doing it and doing it right. And it takes a long time, doesn't it, to relax into your own style and to know how to work. It takes decades. And this was another leap in that sense of having something taken off me and feeling like we were both there together inside something much greater, who was holding us and guiding us in a way. And again, I will say that as a Jungian, you could say that you have that experience in a room or wherever you are, because we are inside the self. And yet for me, the presence of the squirrels and the trees and the wind, and it just felt incredibly healing and holding. It still does. And helpful. And you know, the story that I tell in the first chapter of An Amazing Synchronicity, where I'm working with this person who was the first person I went outside with. She used to get indoors, she would get very, very stuck in a kind of negative transference with me, unable to speak for periods of time. It was incredibly difficult to carry on at times. sometimes I would wonder, do you really want to go on with this? And anyway, it was a very tense and difficult silence. And when we went outside, of course, that still continued to happen, and she would fall into this frozen state of, I think, projecting onto me something about perfection, and she wasn't worthy of saying anything at all. So a terrible judgment on herself. And anyway, we were stuck in one of those silences, and we were sitting side by side, and I was wondering whether to say anything, what I could say. Like squirrels were chasing each other, and I commented on the squirrels chasing each other as a kind of metaphor for sometimes me trying to chase her with a few words from time to time to help. But I don't know that it did help, really. And then we noticed that a spider had woven a web between our shoulders. And that was very, very profound, that moment. It was very profound. And I think it did shift something. It wasn't like a sudden, magically, all her negative transference went away, but it was another turn. It was something very supportive in the work. And we don't. In some ways, I don't know how helpful that story is, because as a colleague of mine once said, "Well, Mary-Jayne, it'll make people think that these amazing things have got to happen all the time when you work outdoors," and of course they don't. But it's just the sheer wonder of being out and how supportive that is for the work. Sometimes my sessions, you would just think the dialogue was the same as being indoors. It moves and changes.
Essa imagem da teia de aranha entre vocês duas é impressionante, está no livro. Mary-Jayne, como é que você está de tempo para a gente poder prosseguir as perguntas? Podemos seguir?
Yeah.
Ok. No. Então tá bom. Então eu vou chamar.
Let's go on. Absolutely latest past. But so if you want another question or two,
tá bom. Sim, temos mais algumas, mas vamos até onde você conseguir. Queria chamar o Marco Aurélio. Ele também é um dos nomes aqui da ecopsicologia no Brasil. Ele é amigo, querido e também membro do departamento de ecopsicologia da JB. Venha, Marco.
Obrigado, Dani. Mary-Jayne, super prazer estar te escutando e te ver pessoalmente. Eu acredito que já li tudo que você escreveu, publicado. Essa história da teia que conectou vocês me tocou profundamente. Já compartilhei com muita gente essa imagem. Eu sou profundamente tocado pela ideia da ecopsicologia, de que nós precisamos honrar no setting terapêutico todas as nossas relações, como diziam os indígenas Lakotas. E que, portanto, as relações com as pessoas não humanas e as relações com o planeta, especialmente nessa fase de crise ambiental, acaba sendo uma urgência que as psicoterapias encontrem as suas estratégias para integrar essa outra forma de trabalho. E tenho feito meus experimentos dentro e fora de consultório. E mais recentemente, pelo meu interesse que a prática do banho de floresta entre no Brasil com uma perspectiva ecopsicológica, eu comecei a experimentar que tempos mais longos na natureza com as pessoas provocam efeitos mais profundos. E comecei a questionar a ideia da hora de 50 minutos, sabe, na prática da ecopsicoterapia. E o subtítulo de uma das principais obras da ecopsicologia, que me tocou profundamente, que se chama Curando a Mente, Restaurando a Terra, me faz pensar até onde uma coisa pode ser feita sem a outra. E tanto a questão temporal, que é o quanto que nós precisaríamos estar com outra pessoa, com outras pessoas, num setting vivo, para que o mais profundo da experiência possa comparecer. E por outro lado também, não em termos temporais, mas que outras formas de psicoterapia nós podemos chegar a criar no ambiente da ecopsicoterapia para honrar essa ideia de que a nossa cura passa também pela cura do planeta. E talvez indo além de simplesmente a dimensão subjetiva de refazer minhas percepções sobre a relação com o mundo natural, melhorar a qualidade das relações, mas também que a ecopsicoterapia possa ser um instrumento de experimentação, de restauração da Terra, junto com a cura da mente.
Together with the yeah. So I'm not. Yeah. Yes, but I'm not sure that I'm following. I'm not sure I've got the nub of the question, if there is a question, or is it a comment?
Uhum. Tá. É, é, bom, a pergunta é sobre: será que a hora de 50 minutos é a melhor maneira de trabalhar em ecopsicoterapia? E será que não existem outras formas que envolvam também uma ação mais objetiva em restauração, na restauração do planeta, como parte do processo terapêutico?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a very interesting point. You know, it's very interesting, this issue of time, isn't it? How in the Western mindset, everything is, you know, divided up into units of time, and we think it's very important to arrive on time. And certainly in therapy circles, you know, you have to arrive on the dot. And when I've spent time in traditional cultures, there's a much more, and what I've learned through reading, there's much more of a sense of coming together when the time is right and spending the time together and knowing when it's time to stop. I mean, then it's very difficult to try and do that whilst running a practice. So I don't really know how to manage that, but I agree with you that trying to bring this flowing experience outdoors where something really deep and profound can happen into this time slot is, you know, longer time would be great. And I mean, I have experienced when I've run groups in Scotland, on the west coast of Scotland, and then we would have a week, and then people can really go deep. But I can't offer that to my clients. So I don't quite know how I would manage a different time scale for my clients, for my individual practice. I wonder whether you have any more thoughts about that. How would you do it?
O que mais me toca é o tanto que a ideia de uma ecopsicoterapia pode modificar nossas noções de como uma psicoterapia deve acontecer.
Oh, yes. Yeah, yes. It changes the work. I would say it changes the work, and it changes. I mean, I think I've already said that it's changed my well, I think I described, how a sense of something, some protective layer fell away when I started to work outdoors. So it's changed my sense of how I am in relationship with my client. And at times I've kind of wondered, oh, am I being too friendly? Because it feels like we're just relating on a different level. And then I've thought about that a lot, actually, and I don't think I am being too friendly, but that's how it feels. There's a wonderful connection that happens in a different way outdoors. And so I think it's interesting, your comment, the book Wild Therapy by Nick Totten. His intention is also to rewild psychotherapy. So it's not just about rewilding ourselves, but it's rewilding the profession. His argument is that, the profession has become too rule bound and domesticated, which I think is very interesting.
Sim. Obrigado. Obrigado.
Bom, prosseguimos com a Fabi, também membro lá do Departamento de Ecopsicologia. Seu microfone, Fabi.
Desculpe. Mary-Jayne, a leitura do seu livro tem sido um bálsamo, né, nesse momento tão difícil que atravessamos. Então, muito obrigada. No último capítulo do seu livro, você traz uma reflexão sobre a esperança, quando você cita o T.S. Eliot, e essa reflexão me abre uma imagem muito viva, a de uma esperança que não promete, que não assegura, mas nos reconecta à teia da vida. Eu gostaria de te ouvir sobre isso. Que esperança é essa que nasce justamente quando abrimos mão das certezas? E como nós podemos cultivá-la na clínica e na vida, deslocando-nos para uma escuta mais profunda, capaz de responder ao que a própria terra nos pede?
I missed that last sentence, going towards a deeper something, the earth.
Deslocando para uma escuta mais profunda, capaz de responder ao que a própria terra nos pede.
So, I mean, I think this issue of hope is really central to what we're all living through at the time. I mean, and I wrote the book 6 years ago, and the world is, it's just, it's so awful, isn't it? I mean, you just think it can't get any worse, and it just keeps getting worse, and it's really difficult to carry on witnessing what is happening. I believe very strongly that I need to carry on listening to the news and finding out what's going on, but I'm finding that it's actually disrupting my sleep. I'm finding it really hard to continue being with it. So this issue of, I mean, especially since things have become so much worse in the Middle East, I mean, as if they were not bad enough. A lot of people, this issue of hope has become very polarized, this thing of hoping for a better world, or falling into despair. And as if somehow these are two ends of a spectrum. And I don't find it helpful to really, I mean, of course, I would love to have a better world. I don't see that ahead of us. if I'm honest. I think we've got further down to go. I think we're facing probable collapse. I find that very difficult to say with around younger people. It's awful, but it seems to me important to face well, what I see is the truth. And of course, none of us know how this is going to play out, what flipovers might happen. A miracle might come out of it, but I'm certainly not placing my hope on that. So I suppose I place my hope in relationship and in seeing the best, finding the best of myself and finding the best of people that I'm in relationship with, and my relationship with a more than human world is incredibly important in this because it feels incredibly stabilizing. It feels like I have some sanity when I go out for a long walk, which I do most days. So I place my hope that as things get more difficult, that we can actually come together in relationship. And of course, the truth about human nature is that all sorts of different things are going to happen, and we see them happening. You know, there will be terrible conflict, but there will also be amazing community action, and people will come together as well as fight. So I think my hope is that we can find the best of ourselves, and my hope is that we can continue to do the best we can for the earth within this incredibly difficult time. And I suppose the other thing that helps me is Buddhist teachings of knowing about relative and ultimate. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with that, but you know, on a relative level, we're going through incredible suffering, and that's going to go on. On an ultimate level, we're part of a huge cycle where of birth, living, and dying. I think this Western culture is collapsing. Which is a good thing, but you know, it's an incredibly painful process, and we've no idea what's going to come out of that. So I suppose I just sort of put my faith, if you like, in the earth, and put my faith in the process, and that there's not much I feel I can personally do to try and control any of it. It's out of our control, even though we can take, you know, we can do our best to take actions in what we believe in. But I don't know if am I making myself clear? Am I making any sense here? Yeah. We need to, I mean, I think most of all, we need to build community. I feel like, you know, and that's not just human community. Building community is absolutely essential at the moment.
Sim, com certeza. Agora eu vou convidar o Diogo, amigo querido também, tem grupos de estudos em ecopsicoterapia.
Olá, boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde, Mary-Jayne. Obrigado pela fala, pelas ideias que você está emprestando para a gente, fazendo circular. Estou contente de estar aqui hoje com vocês. Eu sou aqui de Curitiba, né, uma cidade aqui no sul do Brasil, e eu tento manter vivo assim, o movimento de reunir terapeutas para a gente estudar um pouco sobre ecopsicologia. Ainda sou mais um entusiasta do que qualquer outra coisa em aprender e me aprofundar. E a minha pergunta seria a respeito de uma palavra. Quando a gente está estudando os livros, né, e discutindo aqui no grupo, a gente encontra a palavra cura repetida diversas vezes. Hoje mesmo ela também foi dita muitas vezes. E normalmente essa palavra desperta alguma suspeita no campo dos psicólogos profundos, né? Seja pela ideia de estar associada muitas vezes a um modelo médico, ou até mesmo pela nossa prática com a psicologia junguiana, arquetípica, as ideias do James Hillman sobre a necessidade da patologia para os processos psíquicos. Então, eu queria ouvir de você, saber um pouco mais o que se fala quando se fala de cura em ecopsicoterapia, e porque há uma predileção por essa metáfora no trabalho psíquico nesse campo.
So there's so many different words here, aren't there? None of them seem particularly adequate. And as you know, healing comes from that its root is about making whole, isn't it? But of course, we never glimpse that, you know, it's sort of, it's a glimpse of the wholeness, and then it moves on again, because it's not just a question of getting better and becoming whole and then everything's fine. That's not how it works. So I think I like, I mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with the story of the Rainmaker that Jung talks about, where a rainmaker is called to an area of China which is in terrible drought, and they want him to bring the rain. And so he goes off and he spends some time, actually in the story, it's going into a room. I must say I much prefer the story to be that he goes into a secluded part of nature. But anyway, the story is he goes into a room, and then within 5 or 6 days, rain comes, a lot of rain comes. And so the person who invited him to come said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I came to this region and I could feel that it was very out of balance. And so I went into this room and I spent 5 days. He doesn't elaborate what he actually does, but he brings, so he says, the place is out of balance, so I'm out of balance. So I needed to go and bring myself back into balance. And then the place comes back into balance. So, you know, that's another way of looking at what we mean by what happens, isn't it? Coming back into balance. Another way of looking at it is making amends. So it's not that something is, I mean, sometimes something is healed. I do believe that there are traumas that we have that can actually be healed. But I must say, I think in my own experience, it's about learning to live with. It's getting to know the difficult issues, the traumas. My own experience of psychotherapy is a long-term getting to know my shadow sides, getting to know and knowing how to live with those parts of myself, not reacting so strongly to them, not trying to cover them over, not trying to defend against them. So it's coming to be myself, really. That's the healing. And that's not what I imagined when I started out on this journey. And of course, it's a lifelong craft or practice, isn't it? It never stops. So for me, my relationship with the more than human world is part of it, I feel, is about making amends. I would love to see a collective or some kind of massive ceremony that we might do regularly to apologize for the wrongdoings of my culture. You know, of course, we have to do all the practical things to try and make amends to the earth, but on a spiritual level, how would that be for us to gather together collectively to make amends through ritual? And I suppose it's, you know, it's also about, ecotherapy is not about healing, it's about coming into relationship. It's about getting to know the other, just as it is when you're in a relationship with another human. Getting to know the other, not having, you know, getting rid of the illusions that we have, actually getting to know the person, getting to know the creature, getting to know the woods in all of their different cycles, getting to know a particular place. That for me is in a way what it's about.
Ótimo. Damos seguimento. Eu queria chamar a Lorena agora.
Boa tarde, Dani. Boa tarde, Mary-Jayne. Obrigada pela oportunidade de poder fazer uma pergunta. Eu acho que a minha pergunta tem muito a ver com o que vocês falaram, né? Que você falou, Mary-Jayne, agora, né? Em relação às últimas duas perguntas. Eu queria talvez especificar um pouco mais essas questões que você levantou. Eu queria falar sobre algo muito contemporâneo, né? Que é o momento que a gente está vivendo, um momento em que acontecem muitas guerras paralelamente. E o que me chama muita atenção é como se fala sobre essas guerras. Eu diria que a gente usa uma linguagem neurótica, que é cindida de realidades como o sofrimento humano e principalmente cindida do dano ambiental que a guerra gera. A guerra ela é tratada como um conceito, como uma estratégia, e poucas vezes ouvimos falar sobre o dano que é causado ao ambiente, a morte da fauna, da flora, a destruição do solo, das águas, mesmo quando sabemos que esse dano é causado intencionalmente, através de substâncias tóxicas, né, para destruir a cultura, a biodiversidade e a habitabilidade dos lugares agredidos. Aí eu queria te perguntar um pouco sobre, se você poderia comentar sobre essa atitude psíquica de abstrair a matéria quando falamos sobre as guerras. Isso é um termo do Human, né? Ele diz abstrair significa empurrar para longe, né? Empurrar para longe a matéria, quando a gente transforma algo apenas em conceito.
So are you asking how that can be changed, or?
Maybe I'm asking why. Why does this go this way?
I just think it's part of the anthropocentrist culture that we're inhabiting, you know, that we completely ignore our impact. We ignore our impact on the more than human world again and again and again. So when we report on war, it's just the human suffering. It's not the suffering of the land, as you say, of the other than human world. But we see it in every aspect, don't we? In the news. I was pleased to see, well, not pleased, you know, the Australian fires were terrible, but they did actually report on the suffering of the animals in that instance. And there was lots of footage of burnt koalas being cared for. And so it's interesting that in that context, the reporting is slightly different. And I don't know why that is. I think that it's always the way, because there is this hierarchy of beings and the more than human world sits at the bottom. Whenever there is a terrible thing that happens to humans, we lose the reporting on the ecological. So, for example, before COVID happened, there was a lot going on in the UK about the ecological crisis. There was a huge amount of protesting. Extinction Rebellion burst out. It was really great to see that it was on the news all the time, and people were really taking on board, yes, this is an urgent crisis. Then COVID happened, lockdown, and then we've had a series of catastrophic wars, and then suddenly the ecological was just, it just disappears because humans are more important. Human suffering is always seen as more important. That's how I read it. I don't know whether you would agree.
Obrigada.
Sim. Queria chamar agora o Gustavo Lagares para poder compor aí a nossa mesa de perguntas.
Acho que ela ia falar algo. É, vou trazer então. Boa tarde a todos e
I was
todas.
just going to say, I think this needs to be our last one.
Perfeito.
Tá bom. Ok.
Justo. Então, boa tarde a todos e todas. Muito feliz com o lançamento. Parabéns, Mary-Jayne Rust. Estamos felizíssimos de ter o seu livro aqui. Eu acho que vai ser muito importante para a ecopsicologia no Brasil e em outros lugares já está aí, né? Minha pergunta, ela diz respeito a uma questão um pouco desafiadora na ecopsicologia, eu acredito. E eu quero compartilhar ela aqui. Ela diz respeito a essa ideia que a gente trabalha muito sobre conexão com a natureza. Você até mencionou isso no início, né? Alguns filósofos, como a Donna Haraway, o Bruno Latour, o Tim Morton, o Philippe Descola, eles apontam que o próprio conceito de natureza, ele é, de alguma forma, parte dessa cosmovisão que está destruindo a vida na Terra, né? Então, alguns até defendem que seria preciso destruir a ideia de natureza para salvar a natureza, né? Como que você vê esse diálogo entre a ecopsicologia e outras ontologias não naturalistas, né? Desenvolvidas, por exemplo, a partir da teoria de Gaia ou do animismo indígena, né? Como você vê essa possibilidade de superar, talvez, a natureza que já tende a trazer uma divisão de primeiro, né? Se tem natureza, você imagina que tem cultura do outro lado.
We have to find a way to somehow bring these terms together. So, if we don't have the word nature, how can we I don't know where to go forward from there if we don't have the word nature. But it is a problematic word because it means so many different things. The root of the word nature is to be born. So it is about our birthplace. And then, of course, I don't know whether this is the case in Portuguese, but, it's very difficult using the word nature because it has so many different meanings. And I totally agree with you that it's not helpful to make these separations between nature and culture. And of course, it's about human culture, isn't it? I don't know that I can answer your question. I don't know. I honestly don't know where to go with it. Do you have some thoughts, Gustavo?
Eu acho que um caminho interessante que tem sido proposto, né, passa pelo novo materialismo, uma das formas que ele tem sido chamado, né? Essa ideia de trabalhar, por exemplo, com o conceito de Gaia, né? Conciliando todo o aspecto científico, né? Que vem com ela, é uma teoria científica, com as interpretações que vão conseguir vê-la como um equivalente a outros conceitos indígenas, né? Aqui no Brasil, a gente poderia dizer a terra, floresta Yanomami, que é um povo amazônico, né? Ou outros termos que vão sendo dados para essa entidade ou para as várias entidades que compõem esse planeta, né? Com o qual a gente precisa, mais do que se conectar, negociar a existência, né? Traz um aspecto político para isso que a natureza geralmente exclui, né? A natureza, ela não teria muito o que dizer politicamente, ou tudo, ou diz tudo, né? Então, outras figuras, né? Não precisa ser uma, podem ser várias também tem surgido assim na conversa. Mas é um desafio, com certeza, não terem uma resposta pronta.
Really interesting what you're saying. And I suppose one of the things, rather than talking about nature in this incredibly generalized way, we need to recover some of our, not necessarily our lost language, but we need to actually, just in the same way that psychotherapy has created a language for the internal world, actually ecopsychotherapy needs to find a language that can describe the intricacies of our relationship with the more than human world and how we might internalize it. For example, how does the macro, how do we see it in the micro? If the macrocosm actually lives inside us, which I believe it does, how do we then begin to talk about it in the same way that we talk about internalizing parents, etc. So, and also we have, I don't know whether you have the same thing, but we have someone called Robert Macfarlane here, who is a nature writer. And he has written a lot about words that are disappearing from our language. And then all the new words coming in are to do with technology. So, the Inuit might have, I don't know, 100 different words for snow. I can't remember what it is. The Irish might have 100 different words for the dew on the grass in the morning, or, this language that has been lost, we have to re-find something. And it's not necessarily about getting back those lost words, but actually recreating a language that can really describe our intimate relationship with the more than human world. I'm not quite sure it's what you were driving at, but
Yeah.
Bom, que delícia.
I
Fala,
just like to add, that you were all nodding your heads when I described the experience of the spider's web in my session, and I realized, oh my goodness, you've read it all. I find it really difficult to keep bringing new things out of my practice. I feel I've done enough, but in terms of confidentiality, I don't want to ransack my practice any further. So I keep having to go back to the same old stories. So I'm sorry for that. And I'm an early bird, so that's why I need to make a deadline now. I'm not an evening person.
Mary-Jayne, muito obrigada pela sua presença. Foi uma grande honra poder te ouvir. Eu queria, perguntar se você quer falar algumas últimas palavras, porque eu gostaria de trazer uma citação, uma parte do livro, para a gente finalizar esse encontro tão especial. Se você quiser trazer alguma coisa para as suas palavras finais, fica à vontade.
Um, well, I think, this issue, I feel like this issue of hope is still very important. And maybe even hope is the wrong word when we're talking about language. But I would love to see some more development on that, because I think it's so important to people. I think people are feeling so lost at this time of terrible destruction in our world. And actually, I'm in the middle of teaching webinars at Pacifica, and someone said recently, ecotherapy is the antidote to the wars in the Middle East. I mean, of course, it's not going to alter the course of the wars in the Middle East, but goodness, do we need to remain grounded? I mean, it's enough to make us all go completely mad what's happening. So we must have this daily practice of spending time doing something that actually grounds us. It may not be that outdoors works for everyone, but that's where I get my groundedness from. And I think probably the reason why you're all here is that you probably have that too. So it seems to me terribly important that we continue with that, and that we continue sharing our, as Joanna Macy says, honoring our pain for the world, that we need to continue to find places in community where we can share our deepest fears and horrors and joys.
Acho que a gente estava de alguma forma conectada, porque eu separei justamente uma parte em que você diz que qualquer que seja o resultado futuro, se encontrarmos a renovação da vida na Terra, ou se humanos e muitos outros de nossos parentes forem extintos antes do fim do século, ainda podemos trabalhar para restaurar o equilíbrio tanto quanto possível. Reparar nosso relacionamento com os outros sempre vale a pena, até o fim. Então, acho que eu gostaria de deixar essa mensagem de que, né, que essas sementes possam se regenerar por aí, se infiltrando na cabeça dessas pessoas que têm o poder e as canetas nas mãos, para que a gente também possa fazer melhores escolhas políticas enquanto humanos e que a gente possa estar com, relacionar com, evoluir com outros que não humanos também. Mary-Jayne, muito obrigada. Estou aqui agradecendo em nome do Departamento de Ecopsicologia, em nome do Tiaços, em nome da editora Vozes. Diga. Você fez uma carinha que quer falar.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And actually, one last thought: what if Parliament should meet outdoors and actually pay attention to the more than human world when they make their policy decisions? That would be the day, wouldn't it?
Under a tree.
Under a tree, exactly. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening, and also thank you so much for your questions, which run very deep. Thank you.
Será muito bem-vinda, Mary-Jayne. Tomara que a gente consiga fazer esse encontro presencial em breve. Obrigada a todos que estiveram presentes, obrigada àqueles que prepararam as perguntas e nos vemos numa próxima oportunidade. Beijo.